My name is Jake Morgan. I'm 28 years old, and what I'm about to share happened not long ago in the Ramapo Mountain State Forest of northern New Jersey. I've been traveling in my second-hand RV for several months, capturing photos and writing a personal blog about nature. Growing up, I always felt safer behind a camera lens, as if the world made more sense when viewed through a viewfinder. That sense of safety was stripped away in Ramapo, where I encountered something that defies easy explanation, something I still struggle to accept. I arrived at Ramapo in late autumn. Most of the leaves had fallen, leaving spindly branches rising toward a gray sky. I set up at a small, semi-developed campground near the forest's edge. There were a few empty sites and a dilapidated bathroom shack, but no other visitors. It seemed perfect for someone like me, quiet, secluded, brimming with photographic opportunities. My only plan was to find scenic overlooks, watch for wildlife, and maybe get some good shots for an upcoming photography competition. My usual excitement for a new location, though, felt dampened by a peculiar tension in the air. Even the usual sounds of a forest, birdsong, rustling undergrowth, the hum of insects, seemed oddly muted. I couldn't tell if I was just on edge because of personal reasons. In truth, I'd been wrestling with guilt over my father's death 6 months earlier. He was the one who introduced me to photography. The night he passed, I was on a hilltop shooting a meteor shower, oblivious to what was happening at home. I never got to say goodbye. Ever since, I've been drifting from place to place, searching for something I can't quite define. Maybe it's redemption, maybe a chance to prove myself to him, or maybe it's just escape. But Ramapo felt different from my other journeys, like the forest had a pulse and it quickened at my arrival. On my first afternoon, I stepped out of the RV to explore. The gravel under my boots led me past a hand-painted sign warning about bears. I'd had my share of black bear run-ins in other parks, so I didn't worry too much. My camera felt light in my hands, and I snapped a few shots of the stark leafless trees. In the distance, the slope of the mountains was etched against low-hanging clouds. A breeze rattled the branches overhead, sending a few brittle leaves, skittering along the ground like little brown ghosts. Later, I headed into a nearby town for supplies. At a local convenience store, while I was paying for water and some canned food, an older woman behind the counter said, "Where you parked?" I told her about the campground in the forest. Her lips drew into a tight line as if she disapproved. "Be mindful of nightfall," she warned. "Critters out there. They're not like your average wildlife." I assumed she was talking about bears, so I gave her a polite nod and left. Outside, I noticed she was still watching me through the window, her expression grim. That evening, I set up my tripod at the edge of the campground, hoping to catch the last glow of sunset through the skeletal trees. A flock of crows took off suddenly from a nearby tree, cawing with frantic urgency. My camera lens followed them, but the moment felt eerie, like they'd been startled by something deeper in the woods. I scanned the area, capturing random frames of the brush. When I reviewed them quickly on the camera display, I thought I saw a blurred shape between the trunks, but it could have been a trick of the light. I told myself it was nothing. I retreated to the RV, made a quick dinner over my little stovetop, and tried to settle in for the night. The chill outside seeped in through the windows, so I cranked up a small electric heater. The overhead light flickered once, twice. The wires in this old RV have always been finicky, so I wasn't too alarmed. But then, around midnight, I heard a distant howl. It was low, throaty, and somehow too resonant to be just a coyote. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I flicked off my lights, peered out the window, and saw only a slice of moonlit forest. The howling continued a few moments before trailing off, like it was calling out to something that never replied. I eventually fell asleep, but my dreams were restless. Shapes in the darkness, branches twisting into faces, and a deep hunger that I couldn't define. The next morning, I woke to find my RV battery drained. My phone had mysteriously lost half its charge overnight, too. I've boondocked in dozens of places without that kind of drain, so it made no sense. I set up a portable solar charger, hoping the sun might restore some power. Then I hiked a short distance into the woods, wanting to shake off the weird vibes and find interesting angles to photograph. The forest was both silent and beautiful, in a stark way. Fog clung to the hollows, and I got a few moody shots that I figured might impress the contest judges. That's when I saw the first set of tracks. Large, elongated footprints in the damp earth, shaped almost like a human foot but too wide, too distorted. The prints vanished at a rocky ledge as if whoever or whatever made them had climbed straight, up the rock face. Curious, I followed the base of the ledge for a while. The morning light was watery and cold, filtering in through the skeletal branches. The underbrush crackled underfoot. That's when I nearly stumbled upon a deer carcass, freshly killed, half-eaten, the ribs cracked open as if something had torn it apart in a frenzy. A sense of revulsion and fear crawled up my spine. The deer's eyes were frozen in terror, and whatever had mauled it had left behind claw marks that matched the footprints. I snapped a few pictures, more out of shock than anything else. I'd seen bear kills before, and this was different, almost unnaturally vicious. Shaken, I made my way back to the RV. Along the way, the forest felt quieter than before, as if every living thing was holding its breath. The wind had died, and even the crows were absent. When I reached the campground, I found a park ranger's truck parked beside my site. The ranger, a woman in her mid-30s, introduced herself as Alyssa Kim. She mentioned recent animal attacks and missing hikers in the area. I asked if that was typical for Ramapo. She shook her head. Stay on marked trails, or better yet, consider leaving, she advised. The forest is unsettled this season. Her eyes flicked to my camera. I get it, you want pictures, just be careful, okay? We parted ways, and I was left feeling deeply uneasy. I tried to drive out to a diner for lunch, but the RV battery refused to cooperate, even though it should have had enough solar charge. Growling in frustration, I fiddled with wires, double-checked fuses, and gave the ignition another shot. Nothing. My phone reception was spotty, so calling for a tow was out of the question unless I walked half a mile up the main road. I decided I'd try again in a few hours. Maybe the solar charger needed more time. As dusk approached, I sat in my fold-out chair, flipping through pictures on my camera. I paused on the deer carcass shots and felt a wave of sickness. The raw violence suggested a powerful predator. I'd encountered black bears before, but this was more than just a bear's handiwork, especially those near-human footprints. It brought up old memories of my father telling me campfire stories about shapeshifters and forest spirits. I'd never believed him, but now, a small, irrational part of me wondered if something more sinister was out there. Night fell in a slow creep, turning the forest into a silhouette of twisting limbs. I tried to distract myself by cooking a can of soup. Halfway through, the overhead light in the RV sputtered and died. My entire electrical system seemed to crash. No heater, no interior lights. The phone charger died too. I had a sinking feeling that I wasn't just dealing with normal mechanical failures. Something was off, like an electrical force or a draining presence was feeding on my power supply. The wind picked up outside, rattling the RV windows in a steady rhythm that almost sounded like nails scraping metal. I crawled into my sleeping bag, flashlight in hand. I must have dozed off because I jerked awake at a soft thud on the roof. My pulse hammered. Another thud, heavier, like something was testing its weight above me. I flicked on the flashlight, heart racing so loud I could hear the whoosh of blood in my ears. A creak, then a scraping noise, as if claws were dragging across the metal. I wanted to rush outside, scare off whatever was up there, but the primal terror inside me said stay put. The scraping moved toward the back of the RV, and then there was silence. 5 minutes passed, or maybe an hour. It felt endless before I managed to gather the courage to open the door. I stepped into the cold moonlight, flashlight sweeping across the roof. Empty. My footprints crunched the gravel as I circled the RV, scanning for signs. At the rear, I found fresh scratches in the paint, deep gouges about 3 or 4 feet apart. My stomach churned. I darted the light to the surrounding forest. A branch snapped in the distance, followed by a low, throaty growl. That was enough for me. I locked myself back in the RV, shoving a chair under the door handle as if it would help. By dawn, I was resolved to leave. However, the battery was still dead, and I saw that my rear driver's side tire looked shredded. It was as if something with claws had raked it. I tried not to panic. I had a spare, but I also needed to jumpstart the battery or find a new one. Determined, I packed a backpack with water, a few energy bars, and my camera, planning to hike out to the main road or at least find help at a bigger campground or ranger station. But before I could go, an old man emerged from the trees. He wore tattered jeans, a hunting vest, and had a rifle slung over his shoulder. His hair was white and wild, and he walked with a noticeable limp. He introduced himself as Dugan. Some folks called him Old Man Dugan. He asked if I was having car trouble. When I explained the situation, he gave me an odd look and said, "You picked a bad time to be out here." He offered to let me come to his cabin, which was, according to him, not far, so I followed. The trek took nearly an hour through dense forest and rocky inclines. Throughout the hike, I felt eyes on me, but every time I turned around, nothing was there. Dugan's property was a rundown cabin, perched beside a small, murky lake. Animal. Skins hung from a line, and the place reeked of old smoke and wet fur. Inside, he lit a lantern and poured us both cups of black coffee that tasted more like burnt beans. He spoke in hushed tones about a hungry spirit in these woods, something the local tribes had stories about. A Wendigo, he called it, part man, part beast, cursed with insatiable hunger. I asked if he truly believed such things existed, and he shrugged. "I've heard it at night," he said. "Sometimes I see the bones it leaves behind." Then he advised me in a cryptic way to leave an offering or to keep moving. "You linger too long, it'll mark you as prey." I didn't know whether to dismiss his talk as folklore or heed it, but my nerves were already frayed and his words only deepened my dread. He said I could borrow a spare battery if it fit my RV and recommended I patch up my tire quickly. When I asked for more details about the creature, he just shook his head. "Not everything that looks human is human," he muttered. Night had fallen by the time we made it back to my RV with the battery. The forest seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. We installed the battery by lantern glow, but to our frustration, the RV wouldn't start. Dugan tested the connection, scratched his chin, then said he'd return in the morning with additional tools. Before leaving, he handed me a battered old flare gun. "Better than nothing," he said. He then limped off into the darkness, refusing my offer to stay. Part of me wished he hadn't gone. At least I wouldn't be alone. I spent another night wide awake, huddled against the darkness. The forest outside was alive with strange noises. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, guttural, growls. Once or twice I caught glimpses of movement through the window, tall, spindly shapes weaving between the trees. Around midnight, there was a sound of panting right outside the RV door like a large dog sniffing. My breath caught in my throat. The doorknob rattled and I gripped the flare gun, fully expecting it to burst open, but it never did. When dawn finally broke, my eyes were gritty from lack of sleep. I checked the damage outside. More scratches along the RV, and the distinct feeling that I wasn't safe in the campground anymore. My nerves on edge, I decided to set a sort of trap that night, just enough to see what was stalking me. I set out my portable speaker a short distance from the RV, playing low-volume human chatter I'd recorded on my phone earlier. If the creature really was drawn to human presence, maybe it would go there first. I also left some leftover food near the speaker as bait. My plan was to hide near the RV, camera ready, and if I got the chance, I'd fire the flare. It felt insane, but I didn't see another option. That afternoon, Ranger Alyssa showed up again. She looked grim when she saw the fresh gouges. I told her about Old Man Dugan and what he'd said, half expecting her to laugh. But her face paled slightly and she repeated her warning that I should get out if I could. She offered to give me a ride, but my stubborn pride told me I couldn't abandon the RV. A stupid choice, maybe, but I'd sunk most of my savings into it, and I relied on it for my entire traveling lifestyle. Alyssa said she'd return in the morning. If I was still here, she'd drive me to a safer location. Then she left, leaving me alone and more frightened than ever. Night fell thick, no stars visible behind the cloud cover. I crouched behind a fallen log, camera in one hand, flare gun in the other, feeling adrenaline course through me. The portable speaker played soft murmurs of human voices in a loop. Minutes passed like hours, Each crackle of leaves set my heart thumping. Eventually, I heard a heavy rustle, then a low snarl. I strained my eyes in the dim light. Something tall and gaunt moved between the trees, stepping into the faint glow from my lantern. It had elongated arms and legs, the silhouette of a human, but stretched, starved, with patches of fur along the shoulders. The head was oddly shaped, skull-like, with eyes reflecting a dull glow. My mouth went dry. That was no ordinary animal. Slowly, it approached the speaker, head tilting side to side, as if trying to understand the source of the chatter. Its jaw hung slightly open, revealing uneven, wicked-looking teeth. A rancid smell drifted my way, rotting flesh, old blood. Suddenly, it crouched over the food I'd laid out, sniffing, then let out a frustrated snarl as if it knew it wasn't what it craved. My camera made a tiny click as I tried to capture a shot. The creature's head snapped in my direction, eyes fixing on me with a predator's intensity. Panic flared in my chest. It moved faster than anything I'd seen, covering the distance in seconds. I fired the flare gun. The red streak shot through, the darkness momentarily illuminating the beast, revealing hollow cheeks, long clawed fingers. It recoiled from the bright light, howling in pain or rage. Without thinking, I scrambled backward, stumbling over branches. My camera tumbled from my grip, lens cracking against a stone. The creature advanced, limping slightly from where the flare might have grazed it. My mind screamed to run, but my legs felt like lead. I fumbled for another flare. By sheer luck, I found one in my pocket, shoved it into the gun, and fired again. This time the burning projectile struck the creature's shoulder. It let out an ear-splitting shriek. Its eyes rolled back and blackish fluid spattered onto the ground. I took the chance to bolt toward my RV. I slammed the door behind me, chest heaving. Through the window I saw the thing pacing, snarling. It swiped at the RV's outer wall, rocking the entire vehicle. My heart hammered so loudly I thought it would burst. Then, as quickly as it began, the attack ceased. Peering outside, I saw it slink away, stooped and favoring its injured shoulder. Its movement seemed agonized but not defeated. It vanished into the darkness, leaving me shaking uncontrollably. That night, I barely slept, adrenaline coursing in my veins. A swirl of thoughts battered my mind. I was trapped in these woods with a monster that might be a Wendigo or something akin to it. My father's memory haunted me too. I was so desperate to prove something, to capture an image no one else could. And yet, what good was that now? Facing this creature forced me to confront the guilt gnawing at me. I realized I'd been trying to outrun my regrets in every campsite, every forest. You can't run from what's inside you. Dawn came with a cold rain. I ventured out, ignoring my body's protests, to see if the creature had left any trace. Blood, or whatever passed for its blood, spattered on the ground. Tracks led deeper into the forest. My camera lay cracked and muddy. As I picked it up, I felt tears sting my eyes, the weight of everything hitting me at once. The danger, my isolation, my father's absence. But I had to survive. That afternoon, as the rain subsided, Ranger Alyssa returned. She found me pale, soaked, half in shock. I told her what I'd seen, expecting disbelief, but she seemed more shaken than surprised. "You're lucky to be alive," she muttered, scanning the gouges on the RV. She helped me pack a few essentials, insisting we'd come back for the RV later with more rangers, maybe even animal control. Though it hurt to abandon my vehicle, I knew she was right. We climbed into her truck and I shot a final glance at the forest. A figure stood just beyond the clearing, half hidden behind the dripping branches. Even from that distance I felt its glare. The ride out was mostly silent. Every so often Alyssa would glance at me, her brow furrowed. She finally said, "We'll figure something out. That thing, we can't just let it roam." I nodded, unsure if any amount of official action could tame whatever lived in those woods. My hands trembled. I'd been so sure I could handle anything if I just kept my wits. But this was beyond the realm of reason. She dropped me off at a ranger station near the park's main entrance, and from there, I ended up at a small clinic to treat my cuts and bruises. The staff looked puzzled when I explained what caused them. I found myself lying, claiming it was an animal encounter with a large predator, maybe a bear. The doctor warned me about infection. I barely heard him. In the following days, I stayed at a cheap motel in the nearby town, waiting to see if the rangers would help recover my RV. When they finally did, it was found with deeper gouges, the windows smashed. No sign of the creature, but fresh footprints surrounded the site. I felt a pang of loss. My home on wheels, the life I'd built around traveling and photographing, was in shambles. The question of what lurked in Ramapo haunted me day and night. Eventually, I relocated to a friend's apartment down in Newark, trying to piece my life back together. But the nightmares came relentlessly. Visions of those luminous eyes, the reeking stench of rotting flesh, the unstoppable hunger in that snarling maw. I tried to rationalize it away, telling myself it was just a starved bear, twisted by disease. The pictures on my cracked camera were mostly corrupted, the memory card half-fried. A few glimpses remained, blurs of a tall figure, a vaguely humanoid outline. Nothing conclusive enough to prove anything. Yet in one partial image, you can see a single eye reflecting the flash like a dull, lifeless orb. It's enough for me to know it wasn't just in my head. I keep thinking about Old Man Dugan. Did he know more than he said? The memory of his words. "You linger too long, it'll mark you," echoes in my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine I hear that throaty howl outside, or I'll glance in a mirror and see a fleeting shape behind me. On my worst days, I wonder if something inside me shifted, a darkness or primal fear awakened by that encounter. People ask if I'll ever return to Ramapo. My answer is always an emphatic no. The experience taught me that some wild places guard malevolent secrets. I try to move forward, focusing on future photography gigs, but the slightest rustle in the trees sets my heart racing. I even considered giving up traveling altogether. For now, I'm staying put, hoping time will dull the terror. I wish I could tie everything up with a neat explanation, but there isn't one. Whether the creature is truly a Wendigo or something else entirely, it remains out there, tethered to the gloom of the mountains. Perhaps it's some ancient hunger born of the forest's darkest corners, preying on anything unlucky enough to cross its path. Or maybe it's a manifestation of my own fears, though the scars on the RV and my body suggest otherwise. All I know is that the Ramapo Mountain State Forest changed me in ways I can't fully articulate. I went seeking beauty in nature, but I found horror, and in confronting it, I was also forced to confront my guilt and grief. Maybe that's the only silver lining. I've come to accept that my father's death wasn't something I could control, and I can't control what hunts in the deep woods either. I can only move forward, carry the weight, and hope that some nightmares don't follow me forever. Still, late at night, I sometimes hear echoes of that howling in my dreams. And I remember the creature's eyes, two pale orbs brimming with hunger zeroing in on me as if I were the only morsel in an endless, desolate feast. Whenever fear grips me, I remind myself that I survived. But I also know, in the marrow of my bones, that not everyone who wanders into the Ramapo Mountains will be so fortunate. My name is Tom Harrington. I'm 35 years old, and the events I'm about to recount took place just a few weeks ago in the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey. If you've never driven through the Pine Barrens, the first thing you notice is how eerily silent it can be. The pines grow so densely, and the sandy roads twist like a labyrinth, making you feel as though civilization has suddenly dropped away behind you. I had been warned about the region's unsettling atmosphere, the local legends about witches and ghosts, and even the infamous tales of the Jersey Devil, but I never imagined just how real and terrifying those stories could become. I wasn't alone on this trip. 4 friends joined me in my battered old RV that I'd spent half my savings repairing. My best friend Brian Cole is 34, built like a linebacker with a brash personality and a restless streak that sometimes drives the rest of us nuts. Then there's Michelle, Everyone calls her Mishi. Alvarez, 29, petite, with an inquisitive nature fueled by her background in anthropology. Evan Peters, 33, is tall, slender, and a total tech geek who never goes anywhere without a backpack full of gadgets, including a drone. And finally, there's Serena Baxter, 31, athletic, strong-willed, and unafraid to challenge Brian's impulsive ideas. In short, we were a ragtag bunch craving a weekend getaway from our routine lives. The plan was straightforward. A few days deep in the Pine Barrens to bond, roast marshmallows, and maybe track down some rumored colonial ruins. We'd all heard whispers of ghost towns scattered in those woods, deserted ironworks from centuries ago, a place called Ong's Hat that some claim is a portal, and of course, the ever-present rumor of a long-dead witch who was said to haunt these parts. I'd read enough about local folklore to be intrigued but not truly frightened. It was all supposed to be an adventure, a chance to forget about job pressures and city chaos. I should have known something was off from the moment we turned onto the sandy trail that led to our campsite. The RV rattled like it was about to come, a part which wasn't exactly new, but the engine sputtering worried me. Brian, who was riding shotgun, kept telling me to relax, but I could see tension in his eyes every time the vehicle threatened to stall. Outside, the pines loomed tall and oddly warped, their trunks twisted in ways that made the forest seem alive and vaguely hostile. A crow perched on a dead branch, cawing at us repeatedly, as if delivering a warning only it understood. When we arrived at the campsite, little more than a small clearing with a fire ring near a creek, I hopped out to check the surroundings. The air was thick still, and strangely warm for that time of year. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, and I felt as if we'd driven into some forsaken pocket of the world. The only sounds were our footsteps and the crunch of dry pine needles under our boots. "Home sweet home," Brian announced, trying to break the tension. Serena shot him a look. She was already examining the perimeter, checking for safety or, as she said, any sign of psychos in the bushes. Michi frowned at the quiet, rubbing her arms as though chilled by an unseen breeze. Evan fiddled with his drone, eager to capture footage of what he called the perfect spooky weekend. He launched the device into the sky, but it lost signal, barely 30 feet up. He cursed under his breath and made it land again. "That's weird," he muttered. "I've flown this thing in way denser forests before." I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe the trees or some quirk of electromagnetic interference was messing with his controls. It was just the Pine Barrens doing what it did best, being unsettling. We spent the late afternoon setting up. The moment we popped open the RV's compartments, we noticed flickering interior lights. Serena asked if we'd tested the battery thoroughly before leaving. I admitted I'd only done a basic check. "We'll be fine," I insisted. "We have flashlights, lanterns, and plenty of gas for the generator." But deep inside, a knot of worry started to form. The Pine Barrens were known for messing with compasses and electronics. Maybe that was all this was. At twilight, we gathered around the fire ring. The flames revealed the campsite's lonely surroundings, the silhouettes of contorted pines and the trickle of a murky creek to the south. We told jokes, cooked hot dogs, and tried to maintain a festive mood. Michi shared some folklore she'd dug up, stories of a colonial-era witch who'd been accused of cursing a village. Rumor had it she was executed in these very woods, but her spirit never left. Brian laughed it off, saying, "People blame witches for everything," and poked the fire with a stick. Even though he was acting cavalier, I noticed him glance over his shoulder once or twice. Night fell hard and fast. The sky overhead was clear, but out there, away from the city, the darkness felt thick and intimate, like it was pressing in on us. We all decided to call it an early night. We closed up the RV door, locked it, and tried to get some rest. Sometime, around midnight, I shot upright, heart pounding. A soft tapping, almost like fingernails on metal, echoed through the walls. I held my breath, listening, but the tapping faded away. My mind tried to rationalize. A branch blowing in the wind, maybe an animal searching for scraps. Still, it took me a long time to drift back to sleep. The morning brought a new wave of anxiety. Over a barely functioning stovetop burner, I heated water for instant coffee. Brian and Evan argued about how to fix the flickering lights. Serena, started grumbling about how we should have tested everything more thoroughly. Michi quietly pointed out footprints near the creek, barefoot imprints that looked human but strangely elongated. She knelt beside them, pressing her own shoe into the mud to compare sizes. "It's bigger," she whispered. "And the toes? They're kind of splayed." Nobody had a good explanation. We tried to shrug it off as some odd local drifter or a misprint from water flow, but the mood was definitely more subdued than the day before. Mid-morning, we decided to go for a hike deeper into the forest. The plan was to see if we could find any remnants of colonial ruins Michi had read about. She mentioned an old stone foundation that might have been linked to the family of the so-called Pine Barrens witch. It sounded like a fun bit of exploration, so we set out, hoping to come back to camp by late afternoon. Brian took the lead with a map he'd printed from the internet. Serena walked behind him, her expression scanning the trees for threats. Evan brought his drone along again, determined to capture something interesting, while Michi stayed close to me, occasionally pointing out weird scuff marks on tree bark or odd scorch marks near the roots. About an hour in, we realized we hadn't seen a single animal. No deer, no squirrels, not even a single bird. The hush was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of our footsteps. Brian stopped near a gnarled trunk scratched with a pentagram and some indecipherable runes. Local kids messing around, he guessed, but the edges of the carving looked ancient, the bark around it blackened as though scorched. We all lingered, exchanging uneasy glances. Then came a noise, distant but resonant, a hollow cackling carried by the breeze. It lasted only a second, but it made the hair on my arms stand on end. Brian tried to play it off with a forced chuckle. "Must be the wind," he said. None of us responded. We pressed on, eventually stumbling across a clearing with the collapsed remains of a wooden shack. Moss-covered bricks, rotting planks, and more strange markings greeted us. "This could be it," Michi said, excitement and fear mingling in her voice. She gently pushed open what remained of a doorframe, coughing at the rank odor that wafted out. Inside, we found a small fireplace, stones crumbling into heaps of ash, and the shattered remnants of glass jars. The atmosphere felt thick, almost oppressive. Dust motes swirled in beams of weak sunlight that penetrated the rafters. I could have sworn I saw movement near one dark corner, something slithering back into the shadows. Michi froze. "Did you see that?" she asked. At that exact moment, Evan raised his camera, focusing on the corner. But the lens fogged up from the inside. "What the hell?" he grumbled, wiping furiously. When the glass cleared, whatever we thought we'd seen was gone. Then came another sound, a skittering, like nails on wood, retreating upstairs to what looked like a collapsed attic. I stepped forward, adrenaline spiking, but Brian grabbed my arm. "Don't," he said softly, his bravado replaced by genuine unease. "Let's get out of here." As we hurried out of the shack, an army of flies burst from the fireplace, swarming around us with a nauseating buzz. The smell of rot and sulfur slammed into my nostrils. It was all I could do not to throw up. We stumbled back, nearly falling over each other. "That's enough exploring," Serena declared. Nobody disagreed. The trek back to camp was tense and silent. Brian and Serena argued over the right direction, each wanting to get out of the woods faster, but they only caused confusion. Eventually, we found a trail that looked familiar, though we made it back to the campsite much later than planned. Dusk was falling again, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the clearing. The air felt stale and my stomach churned with dread. The campsite looked undisturbed, no sign of animals or intruders, but something was off. As I looked around, I realized the entire place was too still. It reminded me of an abandoned stage, set, waiting for the next horrific act. Evan tripped over something near the fire ring. Bending down, he picked up a crude effigy fashioned from twisted branches, twine, and what looked like strands of dark hair. The figure was grotesque, vaguely human-shaped. "Gross," he muttered, flipping it around. As he did, a sharp piece of wood jabbed his palm, drawing blood. A few drops trickled onto the effigy, staining the twisted branches. Mishi let out a small gasp. "Put it down," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I didn't need to be told twice. Evan threw the thing back into the dirt, cursing softly while Michelle fumbled for a bandage. Back at the RV, more trouble awaited us. The engine wouldn't start. It gave a sickly sputter, and then died. The overhead lights flickered like a haunted house effect before going dark. We checked our phones. Batteries inexplicably drained. A wave of panic swept through our group. We had flashlights, but the thought of spending another night here with no way to call for help was harrowing. Darkness set in like a thick veil. We managed to build a large fire, the orange glow flickering against the twisted silhouettes of pines. None of us sat comfortably. Brian kept pacing around the perimeter with a flashlight, scanning the undergrowth. Serena inspected the RV's wiring, but she wasn't an electrician. Evan hovered near the fire, cradling his camera protectively, while Michi tried to recall tidbits about wards or protective symbols. "I studied some folklore in college," she said, but her voice trembled. "I don't know if it applies here." Around midnight, the chanting started, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. We all shot to our feet, brandishing sticks, flashlights, anything that could serve as a weapon. The chanting rose and fell as if multiple voices were overlapping in some ancient chorus. I felt goosebumps all over my arms. Then came apparitions, indistinct shapes of people dressed in old colonial garments. Some wore tricorn hats, others had cloaks with hoods. Their features were washed out, translucent, flickering as though caught between this world and another. They circled our campsite, their mouths moving but producing no sound except that chilling chant. Mishi collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily. Brian shone his flashlight at one of the figures, and it vanished like a puff of smoke. Another lingered near the creek, turning its head slowly to look at me. The eyes were hollow, black pits. My stomach lurched. Then, as quickly as they'd appeared, the apparitions melted into the darkness, leaving us shaken and speechless. The silence that followed was worse than the chanting. We huddled together by the fire. Then Serena let out a small cry, dropping to the ground as if her knees had given way. She clutched her temples, her eyes rolling back. At first I thought she was having a seizure, but then she started muttering in a raspy voice that didn't belong to her. The words sounded like Latin or some archaic language. I tried to snap her out of it, shouting her name, but she only screamed, a horrible, piercing wail that echoed into the trees. When she came to, she had fresh scratches on her arms, 4 deep welts that looked like claw marks. We didn't sleep that night. We clustered around the dying fire, hearing branches snap in the distance or the slow drag of something moving through the brush. Morning brought only a small reprieve, sunlight at least, though it was filtered through a gray, overcast sky that made the forest look bleak. Our minds were all the same. We have to leave, now. But the RV wouldn't cooperate. Brian opened the hood and saw that some of the cables looked gnawed or maybe cut. "What the hell?" he growled. "An animal can't do this. It's too clean, too precise." There was no easy fix, and we had no cell signal to call for help. Evan grumbled about trying to rig some of the wires together with duct tape. We were prepared to do anything to escape. Amid the stress, an argument erupted between Brian and Serena. He accused her of losing it last night. She snapped that he was a know-it-all who'd insisted on forging deeper into the forest. Tempers flared until I told both of them to shut up and focus on survival. Tension hung like a storm cloud over us. With limited tools, we did what we could. Replaced a few cables with spares I found in the RV, taped up frayed sections, checked the battery. We cranked the engine, and to everyone's relief, it coughed, to life for a moment, only to sputter and die again, as though something was siphoning off the power. As evening threatened once more, we decided to gather as much firewood as possible, determined not to be left in the dark again. That's when it showed itself more clearly. A hunched figure emerging from behind a thick pine, stepping into the fading daylight at the edge of our campsite. It wore ragged colonial-style clothes, stained with mud, and dark blotches that could have been dried blood. Its face was a horror. White, taut skin stretched too tight over gaunt cheekbones, eyes like two empty pits. I had no doubt this was the witch we had heard whispered about in legends, some dreadful remnant of an ancient curse. We all froze, too terrified even to shout. The figure raised a bony arm, pointing directly at us. Its mouth opened in a silent scream before a sound finally ripped out. A shriek so piercing, it felt like barbed wire in my ears. The campfire whooshed higher, flames dancing unnaturally, as though caught in a gust of wind that I couldn't feel. Evan, perhaps deciding fight was better than flight, lunged forward with a burning branch. The witch vanished in a swirl of black smoke, leaving behind an acrid stench. Our hearts hammered so loudly I thought they might burst from our chests. For a moment, relief that it had gone flickered through me, until I realized it could appear, anywhere at any time. We fanned out to check if it had truly gone, each of us armed with a makeshift weapon. But everything was quiet. I was about to say we should regroup when I heard Mishi gasp. She pointed at the twisted effigy Evan had thrown on the ground the day before. It lay there, half buried in pine needles, faintly pulsing as if alive. "Mishi," I asked, "is there anything in your research about witches tying their essence to an object?" She nodded shakily. "It's sometimes said they bind their curse to a totem or effigy. If it's destroyed, the witch may lose her power." Instantly, we knew what we had to do. Brain conjured up a plan. If we destroyed the effigy, maybe we could lift whatever dark presence held us captive. Serena found a metal bucket in the RV. We built a small, intense fire within it, the flames licking up into the night air. Nervously, Brian used a stick to pick up the effigy and dropped it onto the coals. I worried we were playing with forces we didn't understand. But desperation had overtaken caution. At first, the effigy smoldered, the hair sizzling with a revolting odor. Then it caught going up in a bright flame. We all winced at a sudden ear-splitting shriek echoing through the forest, as if the witch was screaming in protest. The figure materialized again at the far edge of the clearing, reeling backward as though in pain. Its visage flickered, torn, between solidity and smoke. A wave of cold air blasted through the campsite, knocking over tents, sending embers into the air. Michi clung to my arm, and I could feel her trembling. The witch raised her arms, but her shrieks turned hollow, less sure. The presence that had seemed so overpowering moments ago was clearly weakened. "Now," I shouted, turning to Brian and Evan. "Try the RV, see if it'll start." They leapt into the vehicle while Serena and Mishi grabbed what gear we could. The shrieking died to a ragged groan, and I glanced over in time to see the witch lunge toward the fire. She seemed intent on stopping us from burning the effigy completely. Gathering my courage, I stepped in her path, holding a flaming branch. Her eyes locked on mine, black seething pits of malevolence. My knees threatened to buckle, but some primal urge pushed me to stand firm. She let out one final furious scream. A wave of invisible force crashed into me, knocking me back several feet. I stumbled, pain shooting through my elbow where I hit the ground. But the effigy was already half ash, curling into nothingness. The witch flickered, her form turning translucent, edges swirling like a storm cloud. Then, with an agonized hiss, she vanished, leaving behind only the stench of decay on the wind. Inside the RV, I heard the engine crank, sputter, and then roar to life. "Tom, hurry!" Brian yelled. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the throbbing in my arm, and dashed to the vehicle, Mishi and Serena right behind me. We piled in, slammed the door, and Brian floored the gas. The wheels spun in the sand for a horrifying second before catching traction. The RV lurched forward, bouncing over roots and potholes as we fled the clearing. In the passenger seat, Evan fiddled with the radio in desperation. A wash of static buzzed through the speakers, then a voice crackled in and out, repeating some garbled phrase. I heard words that might have been in another language, or perhaps it was just a glitch. Regardless, it felt like one last echo of the witch's curse. Eventually, we found the main dirt road and pushed the RV as fast as it could go. Dust kicked up behind us, and I glanced in the side mirror to see if anything followed. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed a hunched silhouette at the edge of the pines. but then the trees swallowed it up. When we finally reached a paved highway and saw a gas station's neon lights, it was as though an immense weight lifted from our shoulders. We staggered out, stiff and trembling, to refuel and gather ourselves. The fluorescent glare was jarringly mundane after the nightmare we'd just endured. The attendant gave us a baffled look, dust-covered, battered, reeking of sweat, fear, and something else harder to name. Evan quietly inspected the footage on his camera. Most of it was white noise, bizarre static that seemed to peak whenever something paranormal had occurred. But there were frames, half-second bursts, where a gaunt face or the silhouette of that hunched figure was unmistakable. He showed one clip to me. The shack's broken window, a smudge that sharpened into a pale woman's face for a single frame, then vanished. It was enough to confirm it hadn't been our collective imagination. Serena nursed bruises along her arms. They looked like handprints, as though someone had gripped her in the dark. She swore she had no memory of that moment. Michi sat on a curb, hugging her knees, whispering about how she'd never investigate local legends so lightly again. Brian tried to put on a tough face, but I could see his hands still shaking when he wiped sweat from his brow. We drove north, away from the Pine Barrens, in silence. Occasionally, one of us would break it with a question like, "What did we see?" Or, "Was that thing really a witch?" The answers never satisfied us. None of us truly understood the forces that had tried to trap us in those woods. Even now, back in my cramped apartment, I haven't been able to shake the sense of dread. At night, I dream of twisted pines and cackling voices. I snap awake, heart pounding, sure I've heard tapping on the walls. The others report similar experiences, nightmares, an unshakable feeling of being watched. Serena says sometimes she feels an icy presence brush her hair at night. Brian, who once laughed at ghost stories, has locked himself in his condo with an arsenal of newly bought locks and motion sensor lights. It's impossible to prove what happened without sounding insane. We're the only witnesses, and the bits of photographic or video evidence are too warped and glitchy for anyone else to take seriously. But we know the truth. There is something alive in those woods, an ancient malevolence that thrives on fear, and the gullibility of those who dismiss its existence. We escaped, yes, but we paid for our curiosity with deep scars that extend far beyond the physical. I wish I could say this was the end, a closed chapter. Yet sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I see a hunched figure reflected in mirrors, or I catch a scratchy voice on the radio repeating that same unintelligible chant. Maybe it's just my shattered nerves playing tricks on me. Or maybe the Pine Barrens witch did follow us, binding a piece of herself to the fear that still festers inside. My name is Tom Harrington, 35 years old, and this is my warning. If you ever find yourself drawn to the Pine Barrens by curiosity, looking for ghost towns or relics of a dark past, tread carefully. The forest is old, and it holds on to its secrets and its shadows tightly. You might drive home with a good story to tell around a campfire, or you might end up like us, scarred by the knowledge that some nightmares are more real than you could ever imagine.